The blueprint showed 17 ways to die. Ariana Andrew had numbered them personally: cave-in risks, gas pocket explosions, hydraulic pressure failures, each calculation written in the cramped handwriting of someone who'd learned engineering in army tents instead of university halls. 3 days of walking through September mud had blurred some of the ink, but the mathematics remained sound. The problem wasn't her engineering. The problem was the scruffy terrier mix walking beside her, drawing stares from every miner and gambler on Deadwood's main street. Because in 1878, a woman could maybe be forgiven for claiming technical expertise. But bringing that dog? That was asking for trouble. Suki's nails clicked against the wooden planks with a sound that struck Ariana's ears differently than it struck everyone else's. Where others heard the scrabble of poorly trimmed claws, she heard the precise rhythm of brass-tipped appendages striking pine at calculated intervals. Where others saw a wire-haired disaster of a terrier, matted fur and uncertain breeding, she saw camouflage functioning exactly as designed. 15 years of secrecy had taught her to notice these distinctions, to catalogue the gap between what people observed and what actually existed. The Brass Bell Saloon stood at the corner of Main and Wall, its false front painted optimistic yellow despite the Dakota Territory grime that dulled everything to variations of brown. 4 o'clock afternoon light cut through windows that hadn't seen soap since the building went up 3 years prior, illuminating dust motes that swirled like miniature galaxies above card tables and whiskey glasses. Ariana paused at the entrance, adjusting the leather satchel that pressed against her hip. The scorch marks from the furnace accident at the Wheeling Arsenal foundry had darkened to permanent black streaks across the bag's surface, visible testimony to the kind of work that left evidence on your possessions and scars on your hands. Inside, the smell hit first. Sawdust and tobacco, sweat and spilled alcohol, the particular sourness of men who worked underground and carried mine dust in their lungs. A piano sat silent in the corner, its keys yellowed like old teeth. The bartender polished glasses with mechanical efficiency, barely glancing up when the door opened. Conversations didn't stop, exactly, but they modulated, shifted, the way water redirects around an obstacle without acknowledging the diversion. Suki stayed close, positioning herself slightly ahead and to Ariana's left. The dog's brown eyes tracked the room with an attention span no actual terrier possessed, cataloguing threats with the systematic precision of a military scout. Which, Ariana supposed, was exactly what Suki had been designed to be. James Holloway occupied a table near the back wall, positioned where he could observe both entrances and the bar simultaneously. The railroad magnate's suit probably cost more than most Deadwood residents earned in 6 months, charcoal wool tailored in San Francisco and transported across territories where such refinement marked you as either very wealthy or very foolish. Holloway qualified as both. His fingers drummed against the table edge, not nervously, but with the rhythm of someone calculating returns on investment while appearing to do nothing at all. Ariana crossed the room, aware of eyes following her progress. A card dealer at the center table murmured something to his companions that provoked quiet laughter. A miner near the bar asked loudly if she was lost, if maybe she needed directions to the hotel where respectable women stayed. She ignored him, with the practiced indifference of someone who'd heard variations of that question in every professional space she'd ever entered. The blueprints made a solid thump when she set them on Holloway's table. 6 months of calculations compressed into technical drawings that showed exactly how hydraulic pressure sensors could detect gas pocket formations before they exploded. Her father had died in a Pennsylvania coal mine when a pocket ignited without warning, taking 17 men with him in a fireball that burned for 3 days. These designs represented her answer to that kind of preventable death, the transformation of grief into mathematics. Holloway gestured to the chair across from him without standing, a calculated informality that suggested they were equals while subtly reinforcing that this was his territory, his meeting, his decision to make. Ariana sat, ignoring the breach of etiquette, and began explaining the sensor array integration points, while Suki settled beside her chair. That's when she noticed Marcus Thornwell. He sat at a corner table, positioned in shadow despite the afternoon light. 48 years old, wearing clothes expensive enough to signal prosperity, but practical enough to suggest he actually worked for his money. The kind of man frontier towns respected, the veteran who'd fought honorably and lost honorably, and built something new from the ashes of military defeat. His grey eyes tracked her with recognition that sent ice down her spine, because recognition meant memory, and memory meant he knew exactly who she was and what she'd done during the war. She wondered who'd told him about the meeting. Holloway's secretary, perhaps, or the telegraph operator who'd arranged the appointment. Information moved through small towns like water through rock, slowly, inevitably, reaching everyone eventually. Local whispers claimed Thornwell owned half the cattle operations in the territory, that he'd arrived in Deadwood 5 years prior with Confederate gold and Confederate connections, and had built an empire on both. They said he was fair in business, ruthless in competition, and carried his wartime experiences like other men carried pocket watches. Close to the heart, occasionally consulted, never discussed in polite company. They said a lot of things, and in Ariana's experience, frontier gossip usually contained fragments of truth wrapped in layers of exaggeration. What the whispers didn't mention was Chickamauga, the cavalry charge that succeeded because Union intelligence failed to detect Confederate positions. The tactical victory that cost the North thousands of casualties and prolonged the war by months. Ariana knew about Chickamauga because she'd been developing the reconnaissance solutions meant to prevent exactly that kind of intelligence failure. Solutions that arrived too late for that battle, but in time for the campaigns that followed. In time to change everything. She forced her attention back to Holloway, explaining the pressure differential calculations that would trigger warning systems before gas concentrations reached explosive levels. Her technical vocabulary was precise, each term carrying specific meaning that couldn't be faked or borrowed. Holloway asked about installation logistics, maintenance requirements, failure mode analysis. Questions that suggested genuine interest rather than polite dismissal. Then Thornwell stood. He crossed the room with the unhurried confidence of someone accustomed to commanding attention without demanding it. His boots struck the floor with military precision, each step covering exactly the same distance. When he reached their table, he smiled with the kind of politeness that served as its own threat. "Miss Andrew," he said, voice carrying the soft drawl of Georgia plantation country. "I believe we've met before. Or rather, I've encountered your work. Vicksburg, wasn't it? Those fascinating innovations that appeared during the siege, certain reconnaissance capabilities that fundamentally altered tactical planning." The saloon's ambient noise seemed to contract around their table. Conversations continued elsewhere, but nearby patrons had noticed the interaction, sensed the potential for entertainment. Ariana met Thornwell's gaze without flinching. "Colonel Thornwell, I've heard Deadwood speaks highly of your cattle operations." As certain military historians speak highly of wartime engineering breakthroughs attributed to the Union's Field Engineering Corps. His smile never wavered. Though attribution can be such a complicated matter, can't it? Particularly when innovations appear under circumstances that make verification challenging. Holloway's interest had shifted from the blueprints to the confrontation. His fingers had stopped drumming, watching now, evaluating, calculating how this interaction might affect his investment decision. Thornwell continued, his voice remaining conversational despite the accusation threading through every word. "Women processed paperwork during the war, Miss Andrew. They organized supply requisitions, managed communication protocols, performed vital administrative functions. They didn't design reconnaissance systems. They didn't develop tactical innovations that changed battlefield dynamics. Unless, of course, you're suggesting that every military historian and every official record somehow failed to notice a female engineer operating at the center of Union military intelligence." Ariana kept her voice level, professional, refusing to engage with the provocation. "Mr. Holloway, as I was explaining, The sensor array requires installation at specific geological stress points, which means the initial survey work becomes critical to overall system effectiveness. But Holloway's attention had fully shifted now. Reputation mattered more than innovation in investment decisions. Association with controversy could taint profitable ventures. She could see the calculation happening behind his eyes, the mental arithmetic of risk versus reward recalibrating in real time. Suki had risen to her feet, positioning herself between Ariana's chair and Thornwell's position. To casual observers, it looked like protective instinct, a loyal pet sensing its owner's distress. Ariana knew better. Suki's threat assessment protocols had activated, running probability matrices against stored tactical data, evaluating whether Thornwell's proximity constituted actionable danger. And that's when Thornwell made his real move. He didn't raise his voice, didn't need to. He simply said that if Miss Andrew couldn't prove her engineering credentials beyond forged paperwork and stolen designs, then Deadwood had its own way of dealing with frauds who wasted important men's time. He'd heard about her so-called war innovations, the mechanical curiosity that supposedly detected mines at Vicksburg. Fiction, all of it. Which meant the blueprints on that table were stolen, the credentials were forged, and the woman presenting them was a confidence artist running a scheme on the territory's most prominent railroad investor. And in a town like Deadwood, confidence artists faced consequences. His hand moved to his holster, not toward the dog, toward her. The implications settled over the table like smoke, heavy, suffocating, impossible to misread. The saloon held its collective breath. Somewhere behind the bar, a glass stopped mid-polish. A card player's hand froze halfway to the table, chips forgotten. Even the dust motes seemed to suspend their eternal drift through afternoon light. Ariana's mind calculated probabilities with the same speed Suki's internal mechanisms would. Reveal the truth, gain credibility, lose control of 15 years of secrecy. Walk away, preserve the secret, abandon funding and validation both. Every engineering problem had optimal solutions and acceptable losses. The question was, which variables mattered most when the equation included her entire future? She looked at Holloway. The railroad magnate had leaned back in his chair, fingers steepled beneath his chin. Not intervening, not objecting. Watching this play out like it was theater, purchased for his entertainment. This wasn't about her blueprints anymore. It was a character assessment, a test of how she responded when backed into corners. Investment flowed toward people who demonstrated composure under pressure, who made calculated decisions when chaos threatened. He was evaluating her the way he'd evaluate a mining claim or a railroad route, searching for weaknesses that might compromise long-term returns. The sheriff stood near the bar, one hand resting on his belt, conspicuously distant from his sidearm. Fraud accusations fell into murky jurisdictional territory, and a decorated Confederate veteran confronting a suspected confidence artist didn't qualify as criminal behavior worth risking confrontation over. Particularly not when that veteran owned substantial local cattle interests and contributed generously to territorial development funds. If the woman had deceived Holloway, Thornwell was doing the territory a service. If she hadn't, well, she'd need to prove it herself. Other patrons had divided into camps without realizing it. Miners clustered near the back wall, men who worked underground and understood sudden violence as occupational hazard. They watched with the grim attention of people who'd seen frontier justice dispensed in saloons before and knew how quickly accusations became gunshots. Card dealers and gamblers occupied middle ground, interested but cautious, calculating whether this confrontation might escalate into something that required them to choose sides. A few ranch hands near the door looked uncomfortable, shifting weight between boots, perhaps recognizing that a man drawing on a woman, fraud or not, crossed lines even frontier society maintained. Suki remained utterly still. No trembling, no cowering, eyes tracking Thornwell with precision that would seem unnatural to anyone paying close attention, but nobody was. They saw what they expected to see, a scrappy terrier responding to threat with the stillness of prey animals, hoping predators lose interest. Thornwell drew his Colt revolver with practiced ease, the kind of fluid motion that came from muscle memory built over decades. Standard cavalry sidearm, 6-shot capacity, effective range of 50 yards. At 8 feet, missing would require deliberate effort. He aimed at Ariana's chest, arm extended, stance balanced, professional, controlled. The position of someone who'd killed before and carried no romantic illusions about what pulling triggers accomplished. The barrel was steady, his eyes were not. Behind the soldier's discipline, something fractured and grieving stared out at the woman who'd built the machines that killed his men. "I lost 43 men to minefields at Vicksburg," Thornwell said quietly. His voice carried in the silence, words dropping like stones into still water. "My cavalry regiment, boys I'd trained personally, riders who could navigate terrain that made infantry weep. We charged a position that intelligence reports said was clear, crossed ground that should have been safe, and the earth opened up beneath us in fire that burned so hot it melted horseshoes." His hand didn't waver. The barrel remained fixed on Suki's chest. 43 men, horses screaming, smell of burned flesh. I carried pieces of my lieutenant out of that crater because his mother deserved something to bury. And afterward, when I asked how Union forces knew exactly where to plant those mines, how they'd mapped our approach routes with precision that made ambush impossible, Command told me the North had developed new detection equipment, factory-produced reconnaissance platforms, mechanical scouts. The accusation in his eyes shifted from mockery to something rawer, older. The kind of pain that didn't heal, just calcified into permanent scar tissue wrapped around vital organs. Then, 6 months ago, a former Union quartermaster in Cheyenne had too much whiskey and too many memories. Told me about a woman engineer who'd built something impossible in the Wheeling Arsenal. A mechanical scout. A dog that could smell mines better than any cavalry horse could sense danger. Said her name was Andrew. But it wasn't, was it, Miss Andrew? It was you. One woman. One prototype. One genius who turned cavalry warfare into a suicide mission because machines could map terrain better than scouts, detect threats better than experience, calculate probabilities better than instinct. Ariana met his gaze without flinching. "The Union lost thousands at Chickamauga because we couldn't detect your positions, Colonel. Intelligence failures cost lives on both sides. I built Suki to solve that problem. You built something that made men like me obsolete." His fingers settled against the trigger, the barrel still fixed on Ariana's chest. Made courage irrelevant when calculation could predict every move. Turned war into mathematics where the side with better equations won, regardless of who fought braver or harder or with more conviction. 43 men, Miss Andrew. 43 ghosts that followed me out of Vicksburg. And the woman who made them ghosts is sitting right here, asking for funding to build more machines. The moral complexity hung in the air between them, heavy as the tobacco smoke that layered the saloon's upper atmosphere. Thornwell's grief was legitimate. His men had died because Ariana's innovation made killing more efficient. But her innovation had also saved Union soldiers who would have died to Confederate tactical advantages. War didn't offer clean choices, only calculations about which deaths to prevent at the cost of causing others. She could walk away, let him shoot Suki, preserve the secret, disappear back into obscurity where female engineers belonged according to every social convention that mattered. Or she could gamble that demonstration trumped prejudice, that proof of capability could overcome gender bias and Confederate resentment both. Some frontier storytellers claimed that in moments like these, old watchers marked who stood firm and who retreated, and only those brave enough to trust their own work survived the trials ahead. They said the invisible archivists kept records, and those who proved their truth earned their place in histories that mattered. Subscribe to that wisdom, and maybe you'd learn which decisions shaped destinies. But Ariana didn't deal in folklore. She dealt in mechanics, probabilities, outcomes that could be calculated even when stakes felt impossible to measure. Ariana made her choice. She didn't flinch, didn't plead, didn't negotiate. She met Thornwell's gaze with the steady composure of someone who'd survived forge explosions, battlefield deployments, and 15 years of erasure, and refused to look away from the man deciding whether her life was worth 43 Confederate ghosts. Thornwell's finger tightened. Suki moved first. The leap came between heartbeats, between the trigger's mechanical engagement and the hammer's strike against the cartridge. Not animal instinct, not the panicked reaction of a loyal pet lunging toward danger. This was geometric precision that defied biological capability. Body positioning calculated to 3 decimal places, trajectory interception timed to fractions of seconds that no living creature could measure, let alone act upon. Suki launched from beside Ariana's chair and placed herself directly between the barrel and Ariana's chest. In the same instant, the gunshot cracked through the saloon like lightning striking enclosed space. Sharp. Absolute. The kind of sound that temporarily deafened and left ears ringing in its wake. Where a real dog would have been too slow, too late, too dead, Suki executed a defensive protocol programmed 15 years earlier in her workshop at the Wheeling Arsenal. A protocol Ariana had tested on crude wooden targets, but never needed to deploy against a live weapon aimed at her own body. The bullet struck Suki's chest mid-leap, the dog's body hanging in the air between Ariana and the revolver, absorbing the round that would have killed her creator. The metallic clang that followed was a sound no organic body could produce. The sound rang through the saloon like a hammer striking an anvil, unmistakable, impossible, completely wrong for what should have been soft tissue and bone. The projectile ricocheted upward at a 40-degree angle, embedding itself in a ceiling beam with a thunk that sent splinters raining down onto the card tables below. Fur tore away at the impact point, not flesh ripping but fabric camouflage failing. Beneath, brass plating caught the afternoon light, etched with serial numbers in military specification font. ARU-MK1-1863-001. Copper wiring emerged like exposed circulatory system, not blood vessels but pneumatic tubing and electrical conduits running in parallel circuits across mechanical infrastructure. Clockwork mechanisms ticked audibly in the sudden silence, gears meshing with precision that Swiss watchmakers would envy, spring tension releasing and resetting in cycles measured to maintain operational efficiency. Suki's eyes glowed. Not reflected light, not ambient illumination, but internal gas-powered lamps behind glass lenses, activated by threat protocols, burning with steady luminescence that made the terrier's gaze seem alien, inhuman, utterly mechanical. Clear fluid leaked from the puncture point where the bullet had struck. It dripped onto sawdust floor with wrong viscosity, too thin for blood, smelling like machine oil and chemical compounds. Hydraulic fluid, color-coded green for pressurization systems, pooling in small circles that darkened the wood beneath Suki's stance. The mechanical heartbeat became audible to everyone. Tick, 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 tick. Rhythm precise as a metronome. Spring-wound clockwork, driving pneumatic pumps that simulated organic circulation well enough to fool casual observation, but stood revealed now as purely mechanical function. Suki remained standing, fully operational, undamaged beyond cosmetic fur covering and minor hydraulic seal breach. The dog's head turned toward Thornwell, tracking his position with movements too smooth, too fluid, lacking the slight irregularities that made biological motion natural. Then Suki's jaw opened. The mechanical precision was undeniable now. Jaw articulation exceeded biological possibility, opening wider than flesh and bone allowed, revealing internal wax cylinder mechanism that rotated into position with visible gears. The voice that emerged was Ariana's own, recorded onto phonograph cylinders in 1863, preserved with technology that wouldn't become commercially available for another decade. Playback quality degraded by 15 years of operation, but still unmistakably clear. Target identified. Threat assessment, moderate. Recommend tactical withdrawal. Alternative, demonstrate non-lethal countermeasures. The saloon erupted into chaos that somehow maintained absolute silence. Men backed away from the mechanical dog, chairs scraping across floor, boots scuffling for distance from the impossible things standing in their midst. Others leaned forward, fascination overwhelming fear, eyes tracking the exposed mechanisms with the intensity of people witnessing the future arrive ahead of schedule. Holloway stood, expensive suit creasing as he moved, and approached for closer examination. He circled Suki slowly, studying the exposed brass plating, the copper wiring, the clockwork mechanisms visible through torn fur covering. His expression had transformed from calculating investor to stunned observer, someone reassessing every assumption about what was possible. Thornwell's face progressed through stages. The shock of missing his target, confusion at what had intercepted the bullet, mockery dissolving into recognition, recognition crystallizing into something beyond rage. His hand still held the revolver, barrel now pointed at floor, forgotten in the revelation's weight. He'd aimed to kill. A machine had decided otherwise, and that, perhaps more than anything, proved exactly what Ariana's technology could do. Ariana stepped forward, no longer defensive, no longer waiting for permission to explain herself or justify her existence in spaces that questioned her right to occupy them. She moved with the authority of someone who'd built the impossible thing these men were staring at, who understood its mechanisms better than they understood their own assumptions. "Her name is Suki," Ariana said, voice carrying through the silence with technical precision. "Autonomous Reconnaissance Unit, Mark I. Commissioned 1863, Wheeling Arsenal. Operational for 15 years, 4 months, 26 days. Spring-wound clockwork primary drive system, 72-hour operational capacity. Chemical battery backup for sensor array and threat assessment processing. Pneumatic muscle analogs for movement articulation. Threat pattern recognition algorithms based on terrain analysis, acoustic signature detection, and proximity assessment protocols." She spoke with confidence that came from burning her hands in forge fires to cast each brass component personally, from spending 18-month periods testing and refining each subsystem until it functioned with reliability military deployment required. This wasn't borrowed expertise or stolen credit. This was knowledge earned through iteration, failure analysis, redesign cycles that consumed years of her life. "Fur covering serves dual purpose," she continued, gesturing to the torn camouflage. "Thermal regulation for temperature-sensitive mechanisms and social camouflage for operational deployment in civilian contexts. Glass eye lenses contain gas illumination systems for low-light navigation. Hydraulic fluid maintains pressure for pneumatic systems. The voice synthesis uses phonograph technology integrated with threat response protocols." Thornwell found his voice, though it emerged rough, broken by 15 years of compressed grief suddenly finding outlet. "The scout dogs at Vicksburg. Spring of '63, during the siege. The ones that appeared in no man's land, mapping Confederate mine placements with precision that made our positions untenable. The units that made every cavalry charge a suicide mission because they'd already calculated optimal firing positions, approach routes, defensive vulnerabilities." He gestured at Suki with the revolver, hand shaking now, composure fractured. "All of them. This design, this woman, this machine. You built the thing that ended cavalry warfare," Thornwell continued, words gaining momentum, accusations sharpening. "Made us obsolete. Turned war into mathematics where courage didn't matter, where tactical experience counted for nothing, where machines calculated outcomes better than commanders who'd spent lifetimes learning their craft." The accusation was bitter and accurate. Ariana didn't apologize, couldn't make that concession without invalidating everything she'd built, Every Union soldier her innovation had saved. Every battlefield advantage that had shortened a war bleeding both sides dry. But she acknowledged the cost. Innovation in warfare isn't clean, Colonel. Neither side has that luxury. I built Suki to save Union soldiers. That meant killing Confederates more efficiently. Making your cavalry charges suicidal. Mapping your positions. Calculating probabilities that turned your experience into obsolescence. War made those calculations for us. I just provided better tools for mathematics that were already happening. The saloon remained frozen in that strange tableau, a mechanical dog leaking hydraulic fluid onto sawdust floor, brass plating gleaming through torn fur. A cavalry colonel confronting technological obsolescence 15 years after the war ended. A woman engineer holding blueprints that suddenly seemed far more dangerous than anyone had imagined. Because if she could build this 15 years ago, what could she build now? And that's when Holloway asked the question that changed everything. Could the same principles apply to civilian applications? His voice was steady, investor instincts reasserting control despite the impossible revelation. Could autonomous detection systems prevent mining disasters, railway accidents, industrial catastrophes? Could threat pattern recognition identify gas pocket formations before they explode? Could the technology that won a war now save peacetime lives? Ariana looked at Suki, still standing protective guard, despite hydraulic fluid dripping steadily from the bullet puncher, brass plating catching light in ways that made the mechanical nature undeniable. She could build the future. The technology existed, the principles had been proven. Spring-wound clockwork, pneumatic systems, threat assessment algorithms, all of it, functional, tested, refined through 15 years of continuous operation. The question was whether anyone was brave enough to fund it, and whether that future would remember her as a savior who prevented mining disasters and railway catastrophes, or as the woman who taught machines to make life-or-death decisions without human intervention, who created autonomous systems that calculated probabilities and executed protocols regardless of moral complexity or unintended consequences. Some innovations couldn't be unmade once demonstrated. Some doors, once opened, couldn't be closed again. Holloway circled Suki one more time, expensive boots leaving tracks in sawdust scattered with hydraulic fluid. His fingers hovered near the exposed brass plating, not quite touching, respecting the boundary between observation and interference. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the tone of someone recalculating entire investment portfolios in real time. How does the threat detection actually work? Not skepticism now, genuine technical curiosity. Ariana pulled the leather satchel closer, unbuckling straps with practiced efficiency. Pattern recognition algorithms cross-referenced against probability matrices. Suki's sensor array collects acoustic signatures, ground vibration patterns, electromagnetic fluctuations. The data feeds into mechanical computation systems that compare incoming information against stored tactical profiles. She extracted a rolled bundle from the satchel's interior compartment, papers tied with string that had been white 15 years ago but had darkened to grey. The schematics unfurled across the card table, pushing aside abandoned poker hands and whiskey glasses. The progression was visible in the papers themselves. Crude concept sketches on the top layers, rough ideas translated into basic mechanical principles, then engineering diagrams with precise measurements, then field modification notes scrawled in margins during actual deployment testing. Burn marks darkened one corner, where a forge accident had nearly destroyed the entire documentation. Calculation errors were crossed out, corrections written above in different ink colors, marking different revision cycles. Some pages showed water damage from the Vicksburg siege. Others bore mud stains from field testing in conditions that would have ruined lesser documentation. The power source? Holloway asked, leaning over the schematics. Spring-wound clockwork primary drive system. 72-hour operational window before requiring manual rewinding. Chemical battery backup maintains sensor array function when clockwork energy depletes. The redundancy ensures graceful degradation rather than catastrophic failure. If primary systems fail, Suki enters low-power reconnaissance mode. If that fails, she becomes stationary observation platform. Complete failure requires multiple simultaneous system breakdowns across independent subsystems. A miner from the back wall had edged closer, drawn by technical specifics that resonated with underground work knowledge. What about failure modes in the field? Mechanisms jam, springs break, things go wrong when you need them most. Ariana pointed to a schematic showing the internal clockwork array. Each critical system has triple redundancy: 3 independent spring assemblies, 3 separate pneumatic circuits, 3 acoustic sensor clusters positioned at different body locations. Failure of one system triggers automatic compensation protocols. The gears are German silver alloy, resistant to corrosion and mechanical stress. Pneumatic seals use rubberized canvas that maintains pressure integrity across temperature variations from below freezing to desert conditions. Someone asked about the voice recording mechanism. Ariana explained the wax cylinder phonograph integration, how she developed wax cylinder voice recording over a decade before Edison's phonograph made headlines, how the recording process required precise acoustic calibration to capture tactical vocabulary with sufficient clarity for field deployment. The technical vocabulary was too specific to fake: metallurgical composition ratios, pneumatic pressure calculations accounting for altitude variations, gear ratios optimized for torque versus speed across different terrain conditions, spring tension formulas that balanced operational duration against physical compactness. She spoke with the casual precision of someone who'd personally tested each specification until it functioned reliably under combat conditions. The room's perception shifted visibly. Men who dismissed her as fraud or imposter now watched with the wariness reserved for people who possessed dangerous expertise. The transformation wasn't about gender suddenly becoming irrelevant. It was about proof overwhelming prejudice, demonstration trumping assumption, capability demanding recognition regardless of who demonstrated it. Holloway straightened from the schematics, investor calculations clearly progressing toward conclusion. I want exclusive rights to industrial applications. Mining safety equipment using Suki's detection algorithms for gas pocket identification, structural instability warnings, temperature anomaly alerts, railroad track integrity monitoring systems that identify metal fatigue before derailments occur. Textile mill hazard prevention for fire detection, mechanical failure prediction, worker safety protocols. He paused, then added the part that carried more weight than everything preceding it. I also want military applications retained. War Department contracts are substantially more lucrative than civilian markets. You could build peacekeeping autonomous units, border patrol systems, coastal defense platforms. Frame it as patriotic duty, national defense, technological progress that keeps American soldiers safer. There it was. The ethical trap disguised as opportunity. Ariana had built Suki for war. Thousands had died because her genius made killing more efficient, made battlefield intelligence more accurate, made tactical advantages more pronounced. She couldn't pretend her invention was morally neutral, couldn't claim ignorance about how autonomous detection systems became autonomous weapon systems with minor modifications. But civilian applications could save thousands of miners, prevent railway disasters, stop industrial catastrophes that killed workers with predictable regularity. Did accepting military funding make her complicit in future deaths? Or did refusing funding simply guarantee someone else built worse versions without her ethical considerations? No clean answer existed. Innovation didn't stay contained within intended applications. Peaceful technology became weapons. Military developments became civilian tools. Telegraph systems built for battlefield communication now connected commercial enterprises. Railroad networks designed for troop transport now moved agricultural products. The same mechanical principles that made Suki function could save miners or kill soldiers, depending on who controlled deployment decisions. She could control her intentions, not the outcomes. The choice was participate and shape the future, or refuse and let others build versions without conscience about costs. "I accept your investment," Ariana said slowly, each word weighted with conditions she'd spent the last 3 minutes formulating. "With stipulations. Civilian applications receive priority development funding and deployment timelines. Military contracts require oversight committee review, not just my approval, but independent verification that applications meet defensive rather than offensive specifications. I retain intellectual property rights in perpetuity. The patents carry my name, not hidden behind mail proxies or attributed to corporate entities. Any licensing agreements require my written consent." Holloway's expression suggested he'd expected exactly this response. "Agreed. I'll have contracts drawn by week's end." Thornwell had remained silent through the technical interrogation and negotiation, standing near the wall with revolver still held loosely at his side. Now he holstered the weapon with deliberate precision, the gesture carrying finality. "I should have known at Vicksburg," he said quietly, "when scouts stopped returning from reconnaissance runs, when every approach route we planned got anticipated before execution, when courage became irrelevant against calculation because machines had already mapped every tactical option and identified optimal responses." He looked at Suki, at the mechanical dog still leaking hydraulic fluid onto sawdust, brass plating visible through torn fur. "I came here to destroy you before you could change anything else. Your credibility first. And when that wasn't enough," he paused, jaw tightening, "I pulled that trigger knowing what I was doing, and your machine made the decision faster than I could. Saved your life before I finished choosing to take it. That's what you built, Miss Andrew. Something that calculates mercy faster than men calculate murder. And I don't know whether that's salvation or damnation, but I know I can't compete with it." Thornwell moved toward the door, each step measured, controlled, the discipline of cavalry training still evident in posture and movement, despite everything technology had rendered obsolete. At the threshold, he paused without turning back. "You built something that makes men like me irrelevant, Miss Andrew. I suppose I should be grateful it was you instead of someone with less conscience about the cost. At least you understand what your genius destroys along with what it creates." Not an apology, not forgiveness, just acknowledgement. The old order recognizing the new world had arrived, whether he endorsed it or not. Some transitions happened through displacement rather than agreement, through one generation's capabilities becoming another generation's obsolescence. He left. The door closed behind him with quiet finality. 3 days later, Ariana Andrew walked out of Deadwood with funding, contracts, and a mechanical dog whose brass plating caught morning sun through torn fur. She'd patched the bullet puncture with fresh brass plating that didn't quite match the surrounding metal, kept the damage visible as reminder rather than erasing evidence of what revelation had cost. The ridicule had happened. The bullet had been aimed at her heart. Her own creation had stepped between her and death, and the secret she'd carried for 15 years shattered against a saloon floor, along with spent brass and hydraulic fluid. But none of that was the story's real ending. The real ending was this. She'd spent 15 years hiding her genius because the world wasn't ready for a woman who built the future. And then, one Confederate colonel forced her to choose between comfortable obscurity and dangerous visibility. Between protecting her secret and proving her worth, she chose visibility. Because innovation doesn't wait for perfect conditions or universal acceptance. It happens when someone brave enough or desperate enough demonstrates what's possible despite the cost. Thornwell was right about one thing. Suki had made his kind of courage obsolete. Cavalry charges, personal valor, tactical experience gained through decades of military service, all of it rendered irrelevant by mechanical systems that calculated faster and more accurately than human expertise. But he was wrong about what replaced it, because standing in that saloon, refusing to apologize for her genius while a mechanical dog bled hydraulic fluid onto the floor, that took a different kind of courage. The kind that doesn't carry weapons, but carries blueprints. The kind that doesn't fight wars, but prevents them through innovation that makes violence less necessary. The kind that says, I built this, I understand this, and if you're brave enough to listen, I'll build the next impossible thing too. Word spread through Deadwood within hours. The mechanical dog woman. Some called her genius, others called her dangerous, but nobody called her fraud anymore. The ridicule transformed into wary respect, the kind frontier towns reserved for people who demonstrated capability beyond conventional understanding. Suki remained operational, continuing to serve as both pet and prototype. The duality became symbol. Innovation was always both tool and weapon, always carried potential for salvation and destruction, always demanded choices about application that couldn't be made once and forgotten. Some people change the world by tearing down what exists. Others change it by building what doesn't exist yet. Ariana Andrew chose building. And if you remember nothing else from this story, remember that genius doesn't require permission. It just requires someone stubborn enough to demonstrate it when everyone's watching. Someone willing to choose dangerous visibility over comfortable obscurity. Someone brave enough to prove what's possible, even when the cost includes exposing everything you've protected for 15 years. The future doesn't wait for perfect conditions. It arrives when someone decides to build it anyway.
You know what strikes me about this story? It's about a woman who refused to let anyone else define her worth. And I'm curious about you, the person listening right now. What spoke to you in Evelyn's choice to stay true to herself? I'd genuinely love to know where you're hearing this from, what part of the world you're in. Because these stories about courage and choice, they travel in ways that still surprise me. Drop your location in the comments. Tell me what resonated. And if this story made you think differently about power, about who gets remembered and why, share it with someone who needs to hear that invisibility can be strength. Like this video if Evelyn's refusal to be redefined meant something to you. Subscribe, because we're telling more stories about the people history tried to forget, the ones who changed everything by refusing to disappear. And turn on notifications, because next week's story is about someone else who understood that the most dangerous thing you can do is pay attention when everyone expects you to look away. I'll see you then.